Hi, Kronos just got a little brother. It's got the same synth engines, a new arpeggiator, it's called Nautilus, and it costs about 30% less. Of course, the biggest question is what's been added, what's been removed, and what are the trade-offs? We'll explore all of that in this video, including all the pros and cons, and comparisons to other workstations. I'll also take a close look at its workflow. Workstations are known for sounding good. The question is how easy or hard it is to get at their features. Before I start, a quick disclosure. Korg sent this in for review, but as usual, they have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. This channel is funded by viewer support on Patreon, the ad you just skipped or YouTube Premium, and the occasional affiliate link in the description. Okay, let's start with an overview. Like Kronos, Nautilus contains the same 9 synth engines, including 3 virtual analog synths, 2 additional synth engines, one based on FM synthesis and another on physical modeling, and then 3 dedicated instrument engines modeled on various pianos, electric pianos, and tone wheel organs. So if you've been counting, that's 8 engines so far that are completely identical to the ones in Kronos. Then there's a 9th sample-based engine which supports multi-samples and wave sequencing, and it has enhanced new sounds. Now I don't have a Kronos on hand to compare the samples in its HD1 synth to the ones in Nautilus, but regardless, the focus of this video will be on the workflow of Nautilus, and in that respect, the sampling engine HD1 is completely identical. If you're familiar with the design of the interface on Kronos, this one looks quite a bit different. It's actually almost exactly the same, just in sort of dark mode with a few graphic user interface facelifts, but a core aspect of the user interface has been changed. More on that in a bit. The biggest difference on the internals, I think, is that the Karma arpeggiator engine in Kronos has been replaced with a simpler arpeggiator and drum sequencing interface, which I'll go through in detail. Some other minor internal features have been removed as well, for example, the custom chord pads in Kronos, but other than those differences, the essence of the engine in both is identical. There are 3 versions of Nautilus, all with the same internal specs. This one is with 61 keys, there's one with 73 keys, and another with 88 keys. The 88 key version being a weighted hammer action keyboard. All the keyboards are velocity sensitive, but don't have aftertouch. Nautilus, like Kronos, allows for 16 MIDI tracks, meaning 16 tracks where each track can play any one of the 9 synths, leading to crazy potential combinations like these with a lot going on. And so these are 8 tracks, and these are the instruments going on the other 4 tracks in this case. In addition to the 16 MIDI tracks playable in combinations, you can also sequence an additional 16 audio tracks. So say if we go to track view here on the sequencer, you can see that you've got a timeline style interface for 16 MIDI tracks and then an additional 16 audio tracks in parallel. You can create and split layers any way you like. If I go into zones here, you'll see that you can split the keyboard up multi-timbrally, both to keyboard zones as well as to velocity zones. So layers that are activated by different levels of velocity played on the keys on the keyboard. Polyphony is either in the high dozens or up to over 100 simultaneous voices, depending on which engines and effects you choose. Alongside the timeline-based sequencer, you also have customizable arpeggiators and drum kits. And there are hundreds, if not over 1,000 of built-in patterns, and you can create your own arpeggiator and drum sequence patterns in here, up to 64 steps in each pattern. We'll talk about this in more detail later, but this comes instead of the generative style arpeggiator called Karma in Kronos. Nautilus has a built-in 60 gig internal hard drive and 3 gigs of RAM, about 2 of which are free for loading up samples. Both like the newest versions of Kronos, but Kronos has a slot internally for a second SSD drive. What has been pared down the most are the on-panel controls, obviously to allow for a less expensive price. You've got a single joystick control as opposed to 2 joysticks and a mod strip on Kronos, and overall there are fewer buttons and knobs and no faders. The joystick bounces back in both directions for pitch bend, that's natural. For modulation, If you want it to stick, you can program one of these buttons to freeze its position. In an interesting choice for a relatively sparse number of controls, Nautilus has dynamics control front and center. This is kind of like a velocity curve. So if it's off, you get the full range, and turning it counterclockwise makes that range smaller, regardless of how hard you play, which is actually quite useful. These knobs have one of 3 modes, and an interesting thing about them is that you can push them in, both if you want them to get out of the way, but I think more importantly, if you want to put this in a gig bag, you can do that guilt-free without worrying about the knobs. They are a bit wobbly and plasticky, but certainly better to have them than not. Front and center is a 7-inch resistive touch screen. Resistive touch means that it's not like your cell phone. It doesn't respond to any touch. So like capacitive touch screens, you need to sort of press a little bit and hold to affect a change. And that does cause for mistaps sometimes on the smaller buttons. There also is some lagginess to it. So let's say if I go into the tone adjust controls and, sort of touch this to move it up and down, you can see there's, a bit of lagginess. Again, it's usable, but not like your cell phone screen. And you have to get used to pressing it down as opposed to just touching things lightly. If you want, you can also use any stylus to select these spots. It doesn't need to be one with a special tip. Just be careful not to scratch your screen. I find it fine with fingers. They're always around and come in handy. From a connectivity perspective, you've got both USB host and device jacks. The device jack sends and receives MIDI and 2 channels of audio, and the host jack can accommodate multiple devices with an additional hub, including memory sticks, MIDI controllers, a QWERTY keyboard, and even an Ethernet adapter for FTP access of the internal storage. Aside from that, you've got MIDI, DIN, in, out, and through, 3 pedal inputs, 2 switch, and 1 expression, audio inputs with mic and line level gain, which you can set in the interface as opposed to on the back panel on Kronos. That's something you activate here, and you can edit with Shift Audio. You can change between mic and line level. There's no support for instrument level, so if you want to plug in a guitar, electric, or bass, you'll need to pass that through another pedal that can handle high Z impedance. In terms of audio outputs, you've got 2 1/4-inch main outputs and headphone outputs, and then 4 additional 1/4-inch configurable outputs. Okay, let's take a look at the overall workflow for Nautilus. Generally speaking, you've got 3 different navigation levels. The top level is called modes, and there are 7 different modes. Then inside each mode, you've got pages, which you select using the pages button. And then inside a page, you've got a few different tabs. Occasionally, you'll have additional tabs, or you'll be able to drill down a bit deeper, say, for example, here into an edit mode or something like that. Now, if you're familiar with Kronos, you'll notice that dark mode isn't the only thing that's different. With Kronos, you've got 2 rows of tabs, not just 1. The bottom row is the pages, and then once you choose a page, you've got the top row showing these tabs. Now, when I first saw Kronos' interface, I thought that 2 rows of tabs is a bit confusing, but going back and forth between page selection and then the tabs here is an extra step. The screen on Kronos is also a little bit taller to allow for that. So personally, I think this is obviously simpler rather than seeing 2 rows of tabs, but going back and forth to select the page and then look at the tabs and then select a different page and select the tabs there, then maybe go here into the main program, look at the tabs there. Those are, I think, too many steps back and forth. At least for my taste, it does give a simpler look, but personally, I'd prefer fewer clicks. Now, another thing that theoretically would take more clicks here is the modes button. So in Kronos, you've got dedicated buttons for the setlist, program, sampling modes, and so on. But you can program the quick access buttons to do anything you want. So I've programmed button A to go to setlist mode, and then button B to select a combination or combi, then button C to select a program. Then I've got button F to go into the global settings, and button E is compare. Anyway, you can configure this any way you want in the global settings in the quick access page. There are a few built-in presets for this, and you can customize 4 different options. Don't forget to save this when you do, which brings me to the last user interface convention. That's identical here and in Kronos, which is this page menu. And once you've changed settings, in this case, you go into Write Global Settings, and you can save it. Another nice change, I think, from Kronos is that the combination screen is less cluttered. You do need to swap 2 tabs to move from one tab to the other. And especially with these buttons, it sometimes can be a bit difficult, but it's nice to see only 8 tracks at once rather than a more crowded view of more tracks. But some of the views still are crowded, like this one, for example, the EQ screen. Anyway, moving on and continuing to explore the panel, this area is completely different from Kronos. You've got these knobs, like I mentioned earlier, they've got 3 modes. Overall sound design controls, they do what the labels say basically. Then you've got arpeggiator controls, we'll get to this when we talk about the arpeggiator and drum sequencer. And then the user knobs are programmable. This is actually pretty cool. These are programmable along with these switches to control more than one thing if you wanted. So for example, I could have this knob control the mixer for the first 4 tracks or more if I wanted. And that works pretty nicely. If I go back into the mixer, you can see as I move this up and down, all 4 tracks move at once, which is pretty nifty. And then another difference from Kronos is you don't have a value slider or the buttons here. So if you want to change a parameter, you can double tap it, then just punch in its value here. You can still, of course, change a parameter you selected using this encoder, select a different one and do that. Other parameters are changeable again with a double tap. Okay, so that's it for the overall workflow. Before we take a look at the workflow in depth, let's take a brief listen to the 9 different sound or synth engines. I won't cover these in depth because they're identical to Kronos. There are plenty of sound demos of that online, with the exception of the samples that have been modified for Nautilus in HD1. That's the sample engine. Anyway, just put a few programs together with the engines in a row. AL1 is a massive virtual analog synth. With a lot of controls. When you're in program mode, you have this overall highlight of what's going on. Then you can drill down into the various parts, either using the pages or just by tapping on a section. Now, we won't go over all the parameters you can change here, but you can tell that they are, pretty immense. There's 4 envelope generators and 4 LFOs and a step sequencer, which is another mod source. Alongside AL1, which is the modern virtual analog synth, you've got a Polysix emulation, which sounds pretty nice. Again, the familiar interface. You control this pretty much like anything else. So say cutoff control here. Oops. You can drag the interface around or control it with the encoder. You've got multiple pages you can access using the page button, or just go into the program overall and press the relevant area. Dive in that way. Next up is another virtual analog synth. The MS-20 with its nasty and familiar filter. Same deal here. You've got a view of the synth. You can go around either using these buttons or the icons up front. Oops. Yes, you can. And like I mentioned, it takes a bit of getting used to sort of just press rather than lightly tap. Once you do, you sort of have control here. Obviously, it's a bit laggy and doesn't compare to a phone screen. It's controllable nonetheless. I wouldn't call this screen a performance interface, and this dial isn't geared towards performance either. You can see it's sort of like 1 speed. But these knobs are. In these synths, actually, it's pretty easy to map any knob to any CC or AMS's alternate modulation source, basically any mod source. As you can see here, I think maybe I need to double tap here, there you go. So you can control any parameter, not just with the LFOs, but also with a bunch of MIDI CC options and the XY modulators. So the synths are expanded beyond what you'd expect from the original synth, and they do have the familiar patch bay when relevant. SDR1 is a string and physical modeling synth that can make sounds like this too. And this too has a pretty broad range. Let's keep moving on. MOD7 is a FM based or phase modulation based synth. This takes the FM synthesis of the DX7 and expands on it considerably, including letting you use a patch cable style interface to create your own algorithms, which is really neat. So say, for example, that I wanted to patch the output of this oscillator to the input of this one. Oops, it's as simple as that. Then I could set the mod depth over here, the mod level over here. Anyway, again, like Kronos, so let's move on to the next one. SGX-2 is a piano-based instrument. It is sample-based, but there are a few physical modeling aspects like opening and closing the lid and all kinds of internal resonances. Let's move on to the next instrument type. There are a bunch of electric pianos here, both tine and reed-based, so Rhodes or Whirlies, with a set of internal effects that you can mess around with. I think they sound pretty good, but again, identical to Kronos, so let's move on. Tone wheel organs. With drawbar controls, which is always fun to play around with the timbre. Then the last instrument is HD1. For some reason, HD1 can't live in the same bank with the other ones, but we can quickly access another bank where I've prepared a sample of myself singing, which can work with multi-samples. Now, aside from making your own, you can also import multi-samples that you sample externally. I created a sample of una quarta from Native Instruments using Sample Robot on my computer. Now, if you're not familiar with multi-sampled instruments, they're what allow pianos or any other instrument to sound natural up and down the keyboard. So this sample isn't the same as this sample, or this sample, or this one, or this one. If you pitch this one up, you won't get this. So multi-samples means using different samples across the keyboard. Not only that, this supports multi-samples for velocities. So for this instrument, not only did I multi-sample every 3 semitones on the piano keyboard, I also multi-sampled 6 different velocities. So if I put dynamics all the way up, a high velocity sample is different from a soft one. Each of those velocities 6 times every 3 semitones is supported here. That's about 190 megs, by the way. And I loaded this in using the Sound Font 2 standard, and it worked really seamlessly. So this works quite nicely. HD1 contains a bunch of other synthesis options. It's got filters in serial or in parallel, and LFOs and envelopes. Now, aside from multi-samples, HD1 also supports wave sequencing, which is a really cool form of synthesis, which you won't get into in depth, but I'll just listen to, maybe I think this preset is nice. Wave sequencing lets you create an evolving or rhythmic sound by chaining different samples one after the other and morphing between them. So in this case, it's got this wave sequence and a bunch of other things going on. Let's maybe try one more. These evolving tones, one timbre after the other, is what makes wave sequencing special. Okay, so having listened to the different sound engines, let's take a look at how you can organize them and the different modes. There are 7 of them overall. Let's start with program mode, which is what we've been using up until now. Program mode is designed to play either a single sound or 2 sounds together, which can be layered or split. Now, if you're using an HD1 synth, then the programs can only be HD1 synths, but if we go into a different bank, which has maybe one of the other synths. So I could say layer this piano with something completely different, say with tone wheel organ or anything else, the AL1, the synth, or any one of the other 7 non-HD1 synths. Now, programs let you set different levels for each of these, and you can also have a drum track in parallel with these 2 sounds, but programs are designed to be simple, even though they of course have quite a few pages and Yeah, you can split them too, by the way. So if I go into Program Basic, I could set splits for even these two simple sounds. And while we're here, why not do this? There's a shortcut if you hold Enter and press a key. That'll set a split. Let's do that for this one as well. Now we've got a split. Anyway, so program mode is no slouch, but obviously Combi mode is where you go, where you want to set these massive ensembles of multiple things at once. So here, yeah, who knows what's going to happen here? Okay. That's what this Combi has. So here, each of the tracks has its own program, which we can see in here if you want. You can always go in, by the way, and edit a program using this menu. So that's this program. And then you can go back up a level into the Combi. Now, Combis also have their splits. Let's take a look at what's going on with the zones in this one. So you can see how this one is zoned out across the keyboard. Now, this is identical to Kronos again, so I won't go through all of this, but you've got EQ for each of the tracks. XY controls are vector controls, by the way, for these parameters. On Kronos, they're called vector, volume, CC, or envelope. Here they're XY. The idea is to let you morph between 4 edges of this diamond controlling different parameters. Again, going through these really briefly. MIDI filter lets you filter different MIDI events for each of the tracks. So say if we wanted the joystick not to impact a few tracks, we would uncheck them here. And yeah, these buttons are pretty small. But again, long, confident presses is what makes this work. Anyway, combis or combination mode is where you go where you want to play up to 16 different programs simultaneously. Setlist is kind of like the simple mode for Nautilus. The nice thing about setlist mode is that you've got this notes section on top, which here is just a description of what's going on in this particular set. But if you're performing and you need to say the chords for your song, you could always go to fewer slots, make this bigger, increase the font, and put lyrics or chords here up to 512 characters, which I think is a really neat feature. And you've got quick access here to the mixer, to EQ, to the ARP drum page, which we'll get to, like I mentioned, and the tone adjust parameters. These are switches and sliders that control, here we go, various aspects of the set. These are all configurable, by the way, so I could go in here and edit what this does. And you can see there's a nice choice of parameters to control here. These are overall parameters that you control on top of whatever's programmed in the Combi. Okay, so up until now, we've been mostly in familiar Kronos territory. If you're familiar with Kronos, let's talk about the Arpeggiator and drum sequencer, which is the replacement for Karma on Nautilus. So let's maybe take a look at this in action and then see how we program it. Let's maybe say, pick this, Orchestral Inception. Nice. So you've got an arpeggiator and a drum sequencer. And if we go into ARP and drum, we can take a look at how they're organized. Both of them are organized in 4 scenes, which you can move through by pressing these big buttons. Each scene has a programmed arpeggiator and drum track, or can have an arpeggiator and drum track if these are lit up. So here we've got no drum track, only an arpeggiator. And then we can move to scene 2, which will happen at the end of the measure. Now we've got 2 arpeggiators and a drum track, and move to scene 3. Let's see what else we have here. Okay, so then I have no idea what's going on here, but move to scene 4. Anyway, that's how you move between the different scenes and what gets activated in each scene. You can latch the arpeggiator, and as you can see, these buttons work just like the on-screen counterparts here. So let's maybe start from scratch and see how we program this. I'll just go into an empty set list. Let's go for this one, and let's maybe go into a program first. So programs are slightly simpler in that they only allow for 1 arpeggiator and 1 drum sequence, as opposed to combis, which allow for 2 arpeggiators and a drum sequence. So like I mentioned, let's start simple. Let's go for this one. So to kick this off, Kronos does have simple arpeggiators. Up arpeggiator, down, up and down with repeats or without repeats, random arpeggiator, and that's where things start to get interesting. So there are a bunch of patterns here. Actually, if I was to step through them, it would take us quite a while because there are literally hundreds of them in different styles. I'm just running through these for, obviously designed for various instruments, including effects. And some of these are drum arpeggiated patterns as well, meaning that they're intended to be played on a track that has a drum kit on it. So those are the arpeggiators that you can choose from. And like I said, there's a whole bunch of those. Then you've also got the drum sequencer. So that runs this pattern, and we can change that pattern as well. And yeah, there's a whole bunch of patterns, and we could change the kit as well. And this goes on until we stop it or we get to the unused patterns. And like I mentioned, you can program 4 scenes. So scene number 1 could have these 2, and then scene number 2 could have these 2, and then scene number 3, and then scene number 4. So that's how you assign arpeggiated patterns to scenes and how you swap scenes. If you're in a combi and not in a program, you'll see 2 arpeggiators appear here, and you can select 2 arpeggiators and split and zone them any way you want. Now, the nice thing about the arpeggiator and the drum sequencer is that both of them are customizable to custom user patterns. Let's start with the drum sequencer. If you choose drum track, then you can choose any one of the patterns here like we did before. But if you choose either step sequencer A, B, or C or D, you can then program these using these buttons here. And this works just like any drum sequencer that you'd expect. So it should be running here, but let's maybe add some kicks. And yeah, standard stuff. You move across the screen like this, and we don't want that here. We want that here. So that's my 4 on the floor. I could change pattern length, by the way, if I wanted. Let's keep it at 8 just so we have everything on one screen. I could obviously add hi-hats. Maybe. And a snare, of course. Fairly straightforward. You could add an accent if you wanted to certain steps, and you could change the resolution and meter. There's no automation or anything like that beyond that, so it's a simple step sequencer, but you have that if you wanted. It goes up to, I think, 64 steps. Yep. So that is the drum sequencer, and you've got 4 of these per program. Let's take a look at how you create custom arpeggiated patterns. You just select, here we go, let's go for an empty slot, user slot, and that's what I programmed earlier. Let's start a new one. 1601. Okay. Now you program these patterns in global mode. Go into global, go into arpeggiator pattern page. By the way, global mode is where you also program wave sequences and drum kits. Anyway, arpeggio pattern. It conveniently loads a 1601, and then we can go ahead and enter edit. Now here, instead of drum kit elements, you've got the tones that you press. So tone 1 is the lowest tone. So I could have that repeat if I press 1 note. If I press 2, it just repeats the lower one. Then I could maybe toggle between toe 1 and 2 this way. Then if I hit 3, I could add that. And that's how you program arpeggiated patterns. This goes up to 64 as well. And you can, on a step-by-step basis, change a few parameters. So say I could pitch down a step if I wanted. So now that we've got our masterpieces, we could go back into the program, activate the drums, and use both. Now, we can change the arpeggiator and drums in real time, add swing to both, change length, velocity, and there's a snare drum control here too, goes in reverse too, that's cool. It also takes the liberty of adding a clap because I didn't put that in there. Anyway, that's what these do. And there's tempo control here too. And that's the arpeggiator and drum sequencer. Okay, so I think we pretty much covered program combination and setlist modes. Let's talk about sequencer mode. So sequencer mode is where you can create full-fledged songs, and there are a few factory ones here that are pretty elaborate. Let's maybe try this one. I'm so infected by the sound. Okay. So full audio tracks if you want them. Let's take a look at what the sequencing workflow is like. And when you're in the sequencer, you can use exit and these shortcuts to either play through the sequence or say, go back to the beginning. I think it would have been nice if these were printed on the panel. Anyway, let's go to an empty sequence and just very briefly look at what the workflow is like. You've got 16 MIDI tracks and 16 audio tracks. Recording into audio tracks is just a matter of recording audio into the tracks. MIDI tracks can either be recorded live or step sequenced. Let's look at what a live recording workflow is like. You arm record either by hitting record or exit and record here. The minute you hit play, you get a count in of 2 measures and you can play. And this would be as good a time as any to plug my mixing tutorial published last week, analyzing Let It Be by the Beatles. So that's one track or layer. Let's record another. Let's go to track 2. Now I probably should have quantized that, but let's ignore that for now. Pre-count. In my mixing tutorial, I analyzed mixing mistakes in Let It Be, and now it's coming back to haunt me. I'll link to that tutorial below. Let's just go with that. Now, if we wanted, we could of course change any of the instruments. So, pick a bass sound, and why not go with club bass for this? So go back. And I can stop this before we get to where it needs to be quantized. Now, like I mentioned, other than live playing, you could also either step sequence or edit sequences that were played in. Now that's a menu item here called MIDI event edit or MIDI step recording. So if I go into MIDI event edit, I could choose which events I want to look at. And these are the events that are recorded, hit OK, then go ahead and edit this step by step. If I wanted, edit again each parameter, whether the note or the timing. Yeah, and if I wanted to step sequence something, I just go into MIDI step recording, choose the timing of the events that I want to add, and just start playing them. This isn't a polyphonic sound, but you could sequence chords as well. And I could play around with the timing, add rests if I wanted, or ties, and that's how you step sequence. Aside from timeline style sequencing, Nautilus has another sequencing and performance option called real-time pattern play record, or RPPR. I won't demo this because it's just like Kronos, but the idea is that you have a bunch of patterns that you can assign to individual keys on the keyboard, and you can trigger them with a key press or trigger multiple patterns with multiple key presses, turn them on or off. Again, this is just like Kronos, so that's it for sequencing mode. Let's talk about sampling mode. Sampling mode lets you record and edit samples and multi-samples. The workflow here is also identical to Kronos, so I won't cover this in detail. You can sample through the inputs or resample anything that you play onto Kronos. And then once you do, you can either edit the sample, trim it, chop it up, and then assign different samples to different areas of the keyboard using the multi-sample page. I'll link to a 4-minute tutorial by Korg that walks through this really nicely. No need for me to repeat that over here. I will say though that the process is pretty lengthy. You need to save both the samples and the multi-samples. It takes a little while to get used to. They could work on improving this process a little bit to make it more streamlined. Now this doesn't support auto sampling like the MPCs. There is actually an auto sample function here, but that just helps you configure things. makes it for an easy setup to get you going. Say if you wanted to record the audio inputs, you would just do that and hit OK, and you'd be set up for it. But you can't multi-sample an external instrument or MIDI instrument or plugin through Nautilus. You need to do that using external tools. But the good thing is that you can load Sound Font 2 files directly into this very easily. Another thing that I won't cover in depth in this video is effects. Let's maybe just load up a simple program. This will do. So Nautilus has 3 or actually 4 layers of effects. If you load up one of the instruments that has internal effects like the EP, then you can use its built-in effects. Now, aside from that, you've got 3 layers of effects: I effects or insert effects, M effects, and T effects. T effects are just global effects. You can turn them on or off or edit them using Shift and T effects. They're applied to everything that comes out of Nautilus. For these, you'd typically use mastering type effects like a limiter, but you can choose any one of the almost 200 different effects, 197 different effects. Then the next layer back is the M effects. You've got 2 of those as well. These are global send effects. So any one of the 16 channels on Nautilus can send audio to these M effects, which can be any one of the close to 200 effects. So in this case, MFX1 is a stereo chorus, MFX2 is the overb, which is a really nice reverb. Anyway, 2 M effects that work as send effects, and then you've got I effects or insert effects. These sit on the effect chain of any instrument you choose to send them, any track you choose to send them. So now I'm in a program. I can either choose to send the program to the I effects or not. If I was in a Combi, let's load up. I have no idea what's going to happen here. Let's load this one up. So we got a relatively peaceful one. Anyway, over here, if I go into the I effects, you can see which tracks are routed to which effects. If you choose, by the way, you could also chain effects one into the other I effects. And the effects here are pretty extensive. You could see these are the parameters for the individual effects. And as I page through these, you can see how much information there is here on a per effect basis. Obviously, we won't go through these, and these are like Kronos as well. Okay, I think we've covered the main features of Nautilus and anything that I skimmed that exists in Kronos. Since Kronos has been around for, I think, almost 10 years, you can easily find information about those features elsewhere. On the pros side, and this is obviously a matter of taste, I think Nautilus sounds very good, as does Kronos. The synths do a great job and give a broad timbral range. The sampled sounds are pretty convincing too, and if you don't like them, you can multi-sample your own plugins. You've got 2 gigs of memory, 2 gigs free is not too shabby, and you've got 60 gigs of storage, so you can load samples in and out, though if you're planning to multi-sample an orchestral library, you might need to pick your sounds carefully. On the cons side, it really depends what you compare this to. Let's start with Kronos. Karma is probably the biggest thing that's removed, and it was replaced with the Arpeggiator and drum sequencer, which are simpler and I think more accessible. If you have a Kronos, it would be fantastic if you could comment below whether you've been using Karma and your opinion of it compared to what you saw here. Comparing to Kronos on the hardware side, Nautilus lacks aftertouch and has substantially fewer hands-on controls. How useful were those in actual day-to-day scenarios? Again, it would be great if Kronos users could comment below. To me, the main thing that I found disjointing was having to go to the page button and then to select the different overall page. It would have been much nicer if we had 2 rows of tabs like on Kronos, I think. One final point regarding the comparison to Kronos, which I didn't mention earlier, Nautilus currently doesn't have a software plugin to control it from a computer, though one does exist for Kronos. Hopefully one will be made available here as well. I mentioned other differences from Kronos earlier, so I won't repeat them. I think other than the 2 tabs, this is very much on par with Kronos, at least in my opinion. Setting aside the comparison to Kronos, how does this compare to other options? Immediate workstation competitors that come to mind are Roland's Phantom and Yamaha's Modi-X and Montage. I've reviewed both on this channel, so you're welcome to watch those reviews to get the full picture. But overall, Nautilus has more synth engines and flexibility and a more comprehensive timeline-based sequencer. And overall, it does have more features, I think, but with more features comes complexity. The other 2 are easier to use, and Phantom's Ableton Live style sequencing grid is a compelling alternative to the timeline-based workflow in Nautilus if you don't need one. Again, I refer you to those videos for more information, links below. From a usability perspective, another interesting comparison would be to Machine Plus and the MPC product lines, also reviewed extensively on this channel. I know those aren't keyboard workstations, but the sampling and sequencing workflow on those is so much simpler and straightforward compared to here that I think on those fronts, there's a lot that can be improved in Nautilus and Kronos. Sampling here is way more complex, slower, and takes substantially more steps, and like I mentioned, there's no auto-sampling feature here that automatically creates multi-layer, multi-sample instruments from either hardware synths or plugins. Sequencing here can also greatly benefit from a piano roll style view. Finally, on the cons side, this only sends out 2 channels over USB, 2 audio channels over USB, whereas the other workstations that I mentioned send out multiple channels over USB. On the pros side, if you're interested in a keyboard that has the broadest range and palette of sounds possible and are willing to give up direct hands-on control for every parameter, Nautilus is an excellent choice, especially for performance situations where you quickly need to jump from one song to the next and need multiple layers and splits with different sounds. Each of the plugins on their own, I think, sounds great, and the ability to combine 16 tracks of them and take that with you anywhere you go is quite a feat. Now, the actual programming of the synths, the RPBRs, the sequencer, it all does require a lot of poking around back and forth on the screen. But once you have everything set up and arranged properly in set lists, Nautilus can pretty much get you any sound, timbre, and arrangement you want. And if you ever do want to dig into the synth engines and want to know how to make the most of their LFOs, envelopes, and patching options, you might want to check out my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. That's it for now. Hit like if this was useful, ring the bell below after subscribing to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.